Good morning, everyone. My name is Etienne Espagne. I'm a senior economist at the research department of IFD, and I have the pleasure to welcome all of you today to this session on social protection environment nexus in Southeast Asia. Before we start with the welcoming remarks by our research director, Hélène Jouffel-Kitt, I just wanted to say a few technical words related to this platform. So you will see that on the right-hand side of the screen, you have a chat and questions where you can click and ask questions throughout the presentations of this morning. I think we want all this workshop to be as interactive as possible. It is really a workshop more than a webinar or seminar. So please use these chat and questions throughout the program. You may have received already the program, which is divided in three main steps, starting with a presentation on just transition in inland Southeast Asia, review analysis. Then we will move to contributions from different experts and scientists from the field, from different institutions, ERIA, FAO, ILO, etc. And we will end this workshop later in the morning in France with a roundtable and an open, more open discussion that I will have the pleasure to chair. So without further discussion, I leave the floor to Hélène Jouffel-Kitt. Hélène, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Etienne, and thank you for organizing this workshop. So it's my pleasure, my turn to welcome you all to this seminar on an important question of social protection and environmental protection in Southeast Asia. So those questions are paramount in this region. Despite several years of social protection policies, we can see that the share of people without any social protection is still high in this region. So this is the first constat. On the second hand, this region is really stricken by climate change, and four of the 10 main countries impacted by climate change are in this region, by the way. So those both questions and the question of the policy to protect and to mitigate social impact and environment impact are really important. So really, it's important to appraise these policies together, and this is really the topic of the just transition more broadly. We have seen recently in the COP26 that this just transition is important to the extent that countries might reach sustainable mitigation policy in the long run, especially in Southeast Asia. So today we will be happy to have all this presentation allowing us to have presentation of research with our partners. So AFD, of course, is working extensively on the just transition issue, as Anda will present in a few minutes. We can see that South Africa, she will explain, might be really an example of such policies, but she will present more broadly what we are doing in her department. We have entered in this topic with ILO, for instance, but today we will extend and we'll be happy to see the presentation of other partners, such as FAO, area, of course, a leading think tank in ASEAN countries, and with ODI. So I would like also to thank partners, we have undertaken an extensive literature review on just transition in South Asia. This has been already presented, but it will be important. It seemed to us very important to have it again in the broader perspective of how to reconcile this social protection and environmental policy. So I would like to thank Pascal Turquet, Alexandre Bert, and Lingwen T. Fong for their systematic review. And as Etienne said this morning, apart from presenting the research, and we will be very happy to see what other colleagues are doing and other institutions are doing in this topic, what we would like to see is how to, in a forward-looking way, to link, to press together both policies, social protection, environmental protection, how we can have a kind of integrated framework. I think this discussion will be highly exciting, and without any delay, I wish you really interesting exchanges, and I leave the floor to Anda for the first presentation of AFD research on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So I'm Anda David. I'm a senior researcher with IFD based in the regional direction for Southern Africa. And I have to say I'm very honored to be able to say a couple of words in the introduction of this wonderful workshop, which brings together two of our flagship programs, the one on inequality and vulnerability and the one on climate change. And I don't know if we can talk about serendipity, but actually the first time we had started to think seriously in IFD about the link between equality and climate change was after having read Alexandre Bert's paper on this issue and having invited him to chat with us in 2016. And while we are still in the early stages of our research program on this issue, we know that we cannot talk seriously about development strategies and trajectories without making sure that both social and environmental constraints are taken into account. The multiple dimensions of the climate change inequality nexus were quite visible at the COP that just ended, from the huge inequality in historical contributions to climate change to the inequality in voice and representation. We know that inequality and economic vulnerabilities and opportunities are shaped by environmental risks, which in turn impact vulnerability to future environmental shocks. In a previous program, part of the EU IFD research facility on inequalities, we have actually looked at the impact on income inequality of climate variability, comparing Indonesia and Vietnam. And as expected, we show that not only inequality increases as a result of weather shocks, but actually that coping strategies do not withstand the long-term impact of persistent climate variability. Another project within the same program, actually led by Etienne, looked at the relationship between inequalities and environmental changes in the lower Mekong River basin, and covers a multitude of aspects that go from the role of social identities in the governance of flood risks to social justice and mining exploitation, or again, to migration as a response to environmental changes. And a book will be out soon, so I will probably let Etienne say a couple of words on that a bit later. As for the current and future research agenda, I think that we can see it as being structured across two pillars. One actually looks at social policy, and the other one looks at the tools that can be used in order to push the policy agenda on both climate and inequality. Regarding the role of social protection and social policy as a whole, we're trying to look across various geographies which span from Southeast Asia, as we're talking today, to Africa and South Africa, and to Latin America, at how a society can design a minimum protection for the whole population that not only covers the losses of those most impacted by climate change and the low carbon transition, but also ensures that structural imbalances are corrected or at least tilted in the right direction. We know that societies which are more cohesive are also stronger and more resilient when faced with climate shocks. And when looking into what makes a society more cohesive, the reduction of inequality is key. The other pillar around the policy tools covers both modeling, and on the one hand side, we would have the GEM model, which incorporates the interaction between financial and monetary risks with ecological disturbances. And on the other hand side, we're trying to look into introducing and modeling environmental taxation into fiscal incidence analysis. And then we are trying to develop different policy toolboxes. For instance, in Indonesia, we're looking into developing a toolbox which would enable policymakers to integrate the various dimensions of inequalities when thinking about designing and setting up marine protected areas. In South Africa, we're developing a community explorer, which is an online tool that maps a wide variety of socioeconomic indicators, and more specifically, labor supply and demand indicators at the infra-municipal level. And this will support municipalities which are currently drafting their just transition strategies and economic diversification initiatives. We are conscious that there is a disconnect between those who are demanding climate actions and those who are being asked to pay for it. And as we embark on a morning of exchanges on the social protection, I hope that we can also discuss on the funding of social protection and more broadly how it can play a role into enabling a higher sense of solidarity within societies. I will now leave the floor to Etienne to introduce the first panel, and thank you again for all your participation today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anda. It was very precious to have you introduce the theme today. Now we will welcome Alexandre Berthe and Pascal Turquet, both from the University of Rennes in Bretagne, and you will share with us the latest results of a working paper that is very soon to be published in the IFD collection, building a systematic review on the links between social protection and climate policies and climate impacts. So Alexandre and Pascal, the floor is yours now.
Well, thank you so much, Etienne, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon to those who are in Asia. First of all, we would like to thank AFD, and especially you, Etienne, and Sarah, for giving us the opportunity to work on this very interesting subject. We would like to thank also the 7 participants who have accepted to share their experiences, knowledge, and reflections with us in the second part of this workshop. Sorry for all the messages Alexandre and I sent to you, but you kindly replied. We are going to present briefly the second version of our research paper, which will be issued shortly, but we had, let's say, a few layout problems. We've been working on this with Lynn. Lynn is in Hanoi. She will participate in the debate and will respond to your questions, if any. But let's get started now. Okay. So there is clearly growing interest in social protection in developing countries. Despite this growing interest, social protection systems remain quite underdeveloped in Southeast Asia. In a nutshell, most social spending is through social insurance schemes that only cover formal workers, and it means a very low percentage of workers. Healthcare remains largely funded by users' fees, with the exception of Thailand, with means-tested support for the poor, and employment support is not widespread at all. So as you can see on the table, there are great variations between the 5 countries we studied: Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. Great variations with respect to the level of expenditure relative to GDP and with respect to the level of social coverage. But overall, as you can see, both the level of expenditure and the level of coverage remain low in most of the countries, with, again, some exception, and Thailand, for example. In addition, these countries are experiencing a high-intensity pollution with very strong impact of climate change. So, in such a context, the question we posed was, and we still pose it because we have not answered completely, of course, how could social and environmental protection be combined in Southeast Asia? And to answer it, we have conducted a systematic review of the academic and institutional literature. So, a systematic review, which Alexandre is going to present now.
Okay, so after that introduction on social and environmental protection interactions in Southeast Asia, we have to give some theoretical basis to our analysis. In order to do so, we have to first look at a question, which is, does this nexus has been integrated in the policy design? So we first divide the literature in these different ways of thinking it. So if they are not designed together, research identified in the literature will look at ex post evaluation of a nexus. A question like, how the way social issues are managed are influencing unintentionally the environmental issues, or how the way environmental issues are politically managed are influencing unintentionally the social issues. So it's the first way to think to it, non-integrated visions. But nowadays, as you know, there is more and more a try to look at these two questions in the policy design. So then we have some papers that look at social environmental policies, or what we can also call eco-social policies, and also the possibility to consider the environmental risk as a new potential pillar for social protection. Okay, thank you. If we give a look at the context of non-integrated frameworks, you have social protection and environmental protection that can be put into practice separately. These policies are intended to improve social conditions for social protection or environmental conditions for environmental protection, what we call here usual link in this representation. Nevertheless, even if not thought as integrated, social and environmental spheres interact, and the situation in one sphere can co-evolve positively or negatively with the situation in the other one. First, the two spheres can be influenced by same variables, for instance, economic growth, or the way firms are in the country concerned. So it's what we call question A in the slide. There is also, second, environmental protection can have disproportionate social consequences. For instance, with a carbon tax without compensation, it leads in that case to the decline of social condition, but could also endanger the setting up of a policy. So it's the I didn't see a lot. It's the green arrow of question B, and after it could endanger the put into practice of environmental protection. It's the green arrow of political feasibility. And after, it is the same for the interaction between a social protection measure and environmental conditions, as shown by question C arrows. If we think, for instance, at a social policy that induces important fossil fuel demand. Social conditions and environmental conditions could also interact directly, as shown in question D, and as already shown in the environmental justice literature, for instance. In that case, social protection could still be in question. For instance, a policy often cited on social protection climate change nexus is one that, in front of a decline of social conditions of poor people due to climate change, the green arrow there, a reinforcement of social protection is proposed like that as a tool to mitigate this negative social impact of environmental degradation. When thinking after to directly socio-ecological policies, states or other actors can try to respond directly to both environmental and social objectives. Nevertheless, different ways of viewing these policies can be envisioned, and even more crucially, trying to develop socio-environmental policies does not mean that interaction between the two dimensions are taken into account. For instance, often general political aims include social and environmental policies without thinking potential virtuous or vicious circles between the two spheres. In the rest of the paper, we then use a systematic review method to collect papers on this theme in Southeast Asia, inland Southeast Asia. We collect 1,411 unique papers by a selection in the gray and academic literature based on keywords. After screening the documents, we consider 1,307 papers as irrelevant, 74 papers in the peripheral literature, which means papers about themes close of our subject but not dealing directly with it, and 30 core texts that we separate in clusters depending on tools used. We also collect detailed information on that papers that can be found in two tables in our paper. As you can see, there is the variables that are below in the slide, which we collect for every paper. For the peripheral literature, we identify 4 categories of articles. First, for instance, we have 30 documents that was focusing on the linkage between disaster risk management and social issues, but without taking into account if climate change will increase the disaster risk. So then we think it's close for a subject, but not totally relevant for it. And we have also, I will only speak about the second category. For instance, literature on agriculture, aquaculture, forestry, social protection measures, but without dealing with the fact that agriculture could be made more environmental friendly, for instance. For the core literature, we also identify 30 papers, and that papers deal differently with the question of environmental social protection nexus. So first we have literature on payment for environmental preservation, and which include the question of poor people. Some papers look at payment for environmental preservation, but without including the pro-poor dimension of these measures in the policy design. So it's 1.2 papers. And for others, it's already pro-poor environmental restoration dispositives, measures. In that case, it means that they are things to be socio-ecological measures. We have also papers that include social protection as a mechanism to reduce vulnerability of poor people, that look like when you have climate change disproportionately affecting poor people, you will put social protection to protect them. And we have also papers that take into account social objectives in green policies, such as carbon tax with poor compensation. And finally, we have a last cluster of articles with general social and environmental policies in a common framework, but that did not deal with the interaction between the two dimensions. So you can imagine, for instance, a CSR mechanism in a company that have some social measures, some environmental measures, but that did not deal with the combinations between those and the interaction existing between them. And I will let...
Thank you. So, as you can see, academic papers account for half of the selection, and grey literature accounts for the other 50%. So, in general, academic papers tend to assess the effects of environment measures or environment or social tools using microeconomic or econometric analysis, while institutional reports logically emphasize the programmatic dimension. The actors implementing the measures, in fact, they are state, international organizations, and NGOs. Surprisingly for us, private companies such as multinational firms, for example, were quite absent of our sample, as well as CSR measures. So this could reveal the absence of private companies in the social debate, which is rather played out between public actors, NGOs, and international organizations. This could also explain that this debate is more focused on climate change and natural disaster management. This would explain also that other consequences of human activities on the environment, such as greenhouse gas emissions, for example, are only marginally addressed in the papers we studied. According to the target, the target are always the poor and the vulnerable. This means that the measures are assistance-based or quite residual. And this means also that the measures described or studied in the selected papers have no link with social security schemes that we described in the first part of the paper. The existing social security schemes are mostly insurance-based. And as you know, of course, in most of the countries, the authorities seek to broaden the scope of these schemes and try to develop universal coverage, especially in the healthcare. But the question of introducing environmental risks or measures in existing or future schemes is rarely posed, in fact, even though the broadening of social protection schemes could provide an opportunity for this. But the papers don't deal with that. And as a consequence, the papers also lack of evidence on the link between health coverage and the environment. So accordingly, the analysis focus more on tools than on broad policy or social welfare models. No paper, for example, was found about welfare systems in general, including systems that integrate both social and environmental protection. Selected references, so the 30 we selected at the end, selected references rarely include a comprehensive view of social protection, nor a reflection about the context of implementation, the broad context of implementation. However, Thailand and Vietnam are much more represented in our sample, which is consistent with the fact that specific measures are easier to put in place when social security schemes, or let's say social schemes, already exist, as shown by ILO or FAO, for example. So this leads us to a central question, which is a central question for future research. What could be the future of a social protection system, including environmental issues in Southeast Asia countries? And this leads, of course, to some sub-questions for our debate this morning and the future. The question of the perimeter for social protection, the perimeter regarding the tools. For example, under what conditions could agriculture or aquaculture measures could be seen as social protection measures? Perimeter related to the actors. What role for the private sector, for example, the private insurance and private companies, occupational welfare, for example, and what beneficiaries, and the question of the beneficiaries poses the question of the scope for solidarity, Anda was evoking a few minutes ago. So I think we should move from ad hoc solutions to more inclusive regimes. This means to have, or this would need us to have a more broad vision and a more comprehensive view of social protection regimes. And other question maybe for the debate or for the future, how to take into account the wide range of environmental issues that are not taken, all of them are not taken into account or are not analyzed in the selected papers. Climate change is analyzed, of course, floods, but also local pollutions or waste management. And last but not least, are environmental issues a threat or an opportunity for the development of social protection in the region? We hope it is an opportunity, but we will be happy to listen to the participants during the round table. So thank you for your attention, and we hope you'll be interested in the research paper, which should be issued shortly. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Pascal and Alexandre and Lynn also for this presentation that really sets the stage for the discussions that we will have now. I think we have a second moment of other brief presentations from a wide array of high-level experts, and for that moment, I leave the floor to Sarah Morchillo, who will introduce them and manage the discussion and the questions.
Thank you, Etienne. Hello, everyone. So I am Sarah Morcillo. I am a research officer at AFD, and I'm really happy to be here for this workshop on the links between social protection and environmental protection in Southeast Asia. Thank you, Pascal, Alexandre, and Lynn, for this rich study and this enlightening presentation. And also a big thank you to all the participants, spectators, and presenters for your interest in this important issue. So, as Etienne said, during this session, we will have the pleasure to listen to experts on this topic from different organizations who will share with us their work and their experience on this matter. So, I'm going to present to you the presentation we will have. So, yes. I don't know if you can see. So we will have 4 presentations. So thank you all for being here today and presenting your work. You have 15 minutes each, and we may take 1 or 2 questions specific to each presentation at the end of each one. And then, if time allows, we will have Q&A session at the end of all the presentations before moving to the round table. So, first of all, we will start with Dr. Ambu from Area, who is going to present his work on climate. Sorry, I'm just okay. That's okay. So Dr. Ambu from Area, who is going to present his work on climate, inclusive growth, and social protection. So, Dr. Ambu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and it is my pleasure to be here this morning. Basically, I'm based in Jakarta. I belong to Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. We have a project on ASEAN 2040, that is which aims for a more sustainable and resilient ASEAN. So my presentation is the experts of this study, that key findings that is coming from that study. It is my great pleasure to be here and sharing some of the insights of that study. And if you look into this ASEAN, this 10 small and medium-sized economies, they are much prone to this climate risk. And there are this natural disaster has been increasing in frequency and also the magnitude. And the second risk they are facing is ASEAN now that is celebrating 53rd year, and here we found there is a lot of demographic and industrial changes. These industrial changes, which ASEAN countries, starting from Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, the first league of ASEAN countries, they become a part of the production networks, global supply chains, and they basically alleviated the poverty. They lifted the most of the people, and now ASEAN has 600 million people, and we can say that is within the 30-year period, nearly 30 million people has been lifted out of the poverty. But at the same time, and this inequality is increasing, and so this industrialization has the product of inequality, and also it brings up the environmental risk. Today, these concerns for this climate risk and the environmental sustainability becomes a threshold level. And yes, you can see from the magnitude of these issues. This environmental and the social production nexus is much more intervened in this region, because this region is the most biologically diverse, and most of the rainforests are here, and this water cycle is interlinked. And this solid waste management is becoming an threshold issue, particularly in the urban areas. And when combined with this climate change and the disasters, we find a complete nexus between the development and then social production and then environmental sustainability. How we are going to tackle this issue, it is a very complex. This complexity comes because these regions are unlike France or unlike in the Western world, here these countries are still struggling to tackle these social production issues, particularly these environmental issues that could be classified into three generational. The first is the land use changes, second one is the soil and water pollution, and third is the climate change. So this nexus of the tissues also elaborated from various cycle of innovations. This is what how the future of ASEAN will be looking like, and if this business as usual scenario goes up, this population will be more than we have, about say 750 million people, and these people per capita income will be nearly tripled to nearly $9,000 per capita. So this prosperity will be resulting in this increase the carbon emissions, but this risk of the climate risk will continue. So what the region has been thinking is this is kind of one of the indicators how this vulnerable these 10 countries are. And here if you find this is the on the right hand side, you can see there is the nearly 7 countries are in the top 50 list of countries in the global list of the countries that is subjected to the climate risk. Then it is also linked with these other areas like access to this safe water and this material footprint, and as well as the deforestation rate. So here we find the social production issues and this climate risk and the other environmental issues are very much interlinked. So then this region as a whole, and here we have two type of or two categories of the economies. First, this, as I mentioned, this maritime economies of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore, and they are the front runners, and they have been leading it. And the second leg of countries, we have the landlocked countries like Laos, Cambodia, and also Myanmar, and these countries also kind of there is a developmental gaps, and these are much more agrarian countries, the latter leg of countries, and so this ASEAN, these 10 countries, they work on the principles of collaboration, compromise, and cooperation, and they developed a ASEAN socio-cultural community blueprint that look into sectoral aspects, particularly agriculture and the environmental issues. Then ASEAN economic community, it was kind of building a open trade relationship among the countries that focus on the economic community. And these are the two regional visions, the blueprint that exists, that look into the sustainability and the social production issues. And in the ASEAN 2025, we have a sustainable ASEAN Sustainable Development Goals that is built upon this 2030 agenda and also the Paris Agreement. So these are the kind of a macro regional policy framework where each country is contributing for the social protection and the environmental sustainability policies. But if you look into it, still we have the problems in measuring this level of the social production and the environmental sustainability. One of these is key performance indicators. The key performance indicators has the problem with the data, and also countries is moving towards absorption of the new technologies. For example, tackling the climate change. The industry 4.0 type of technologies has been introduced in bringing the resilience to the communities. So here also the countries, they because of the diversity of the countries, due to this developmental status and also the economic structure, and as well this social production measures is causing for much developmental gaps. And this is a kind of nexus this our 2040 study has focused on. Here we find the climate change, and there is some friction between the climate change, SDGs, and this regional trade. And here the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, basically which focuses for the open trade in the developing the supply chain. And here we find the farmers and the small and medium enterprises that has been fit in the global value chains are more resilient, and they are socially, the members, the shareholders are protected. On the other hand, we do have the climate. We find the climate risk is much more evident in the coastal areas and the fisheries and the agriculture sector. If we combine together, and we did an analysis, and we find most of the countries, because of this lack of coherent policies for the social protection, and also sectoral segmentation, and they may be failing to meet these SDGs goals, particularly the SDG 2, 3, and 4 that is linked to the food security. But this is where ASEAN countries differ, and most of these social protection policies and the climate risk basically dealt with the coping strategies, which is a kind of a short-term reactive response to change in the intermediate to immediate environmental shocks, like a climate change or the disasters. Here, the classical example is these national budgets, emergency budgets, immediately released after the disaster event. But on the hand, the adaptation is very much a long-term response, and which has been tackled by the ASEAN Social Community Blueprint, which has the 10 sectoral actions has been identified. They wanted a kind of, it aimed for a system responses. So this research system responses are focused on the 4 areas. One is the developing an ecosystem resilience, bring the biodiversity and the rural areas. Second is the developing the capacity and the new value chains, and supporting the governance infrastructure, mainly aiming for these local governments, and also improving the socio-economic condition, where the social protection policies are broader strategy of improving the livelihood conditions or the quality of life of the people. So here we have the actions taken at the community level, and also this intermediate level. This is a kind of measure level between the communities and the local governments, and then also sector level between the agriculture, fisheries, and then the tourism sector. Here, the tourism sector, agro-tourism sector, is also important in some of the lower Mekong Basin countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and Myanmar. And here, this tourism sector is also equally intervened. And here, most of the poverty reduction and the inequality also happen whether these operators are in the upstream or lower end of the tourism value chain. So this is a kind of map that is we built, and what could be the type of new, how to embrace these new technologies. And here find there is a potential opportunities for harnessing these digital technologies for improving the resilience and also bring the social protection, particularly locating where these vulnerable groups are there, and then the governments could target their policy interventions. What's happening in most of these least developed countries within the ASEAN, and Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar, is targeting, that is the poverty targeting, and also social targeting the policies for the social protection. Here, a mismatch between the intended beneficiaries and also the real beneficiaries. So here we found that there is a potential role for technologies that has been practiced and that has been proven very successful in some economies like Indonesia and Thailand. So based on this availability, and we developed a kind of resilience roadmap for the ASEAN, and which focus on 3 phases and between 20 to 2040. And here it focus on analyzing the climate risk with the advanced technologies, then making the risk management, and finally, that is how to mainstreaming the adaptation programs with the advent of the agriculture and the new technologies. So here, what we faces in terms of challenges in enhancing the social production, and here I find 4 main constraints. One is the large scale and rapid growth of the coastal areas, and it is happening in the Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia because of these maritime economies. And also there is the urban and rural planning, and the regulations usually bypass the poor because of this land holding, this access to the land holding and the land rights. And also there is a limited policy coverage for the informal sector. For example, people living in the slums, in the urban slums and the rural slums. Here the policy targeting and the policy coverage is limited. And then also we found the institutional deficiencies. That is a leakage, basically. It also happened during the COVID, and when the central government of Indonesia has released the financial packages, but only 40% could be able to reach this targeted population. Here we find a kind of integrated policies or the implementation capacity of the institutions that exist. The policies are very good and it is very effective, but we do have that implementation deficits at the meso and the local level. So this shows a kind of readiness and for this ASEAN economists and economists in embracing this climate technologies that can bring the social protection. And here we find a very wide range of policy indicators, and we basically analyzed that there are 6 indicators to measure these overall ratings, and we find this is a 0 to 10 scale, and we find some of countries are moving fast, and some countries are initiators, and some countries are lagging behind. And particularly in terms of educational capacity and the labor market efficiency, and as well as the financial inclusion. And these are all are interlinked to give the social protection measures. So there is a possibility for these countries to learn from each other. So there is a kind of regional level, we have a kind of a common social protection policies. So this is my last 2 slide, and so, but we do have opportunities for experimentation and as well as the activation, because most of the national policies are very much inclusive and in the design. And for example, the policies in Thailand as a community mortgage program, and the policies in Indonesia look for the balanced housing development in the rural areas and the urban areas. And we do have a inclusive urban and rural development programs that harness the technologies, ICT technologies, like smart city programs, and also green belt programs in Vietnam, and which is inclusive of the rural villages, and also tapping the potentials of the private sector. And here we found many social entrepreneurs, and particularly during this pandemic period also we have seen it. So this social local social entrepreneurship is coming out, and we do find several examples, and though it is isolated events, new public-private partnership where this extended enterprise models has been introduced at the different countries to bring the social production, where some part of this, particularly it is true for small and medium enterprises sitting on the global value chain. So these are the opportunities. They are happening at the small scale, and isolated cases there is opportunity for upscale. So this is my last slide, and so how we can improve and how we can move forward, bringing a universal social protection message. And here this our project, this paper is available on the website. You can look into it. So we identified there are 4 impact areas. One is the developing the partnership, and the developing the partnership mean between the technology developers and the social scientists and then environmental experts. So that is this niche technologies and then ICT technologies could be utilized fully for making this social production and the sustainability gains. And the second is this developing that innovative investment platforms and the financing structure and the business models. Here we need to see to bringing this private sector, particularly the technology developers and the financial business models, and they cooperate with these local people to bring the social protection benefits. This new initiatives taken for the circular economy and the climate risk bonds that is issued by in Singapore and Indonesia and Malaysia, they created this kind of programs for the private sector to bring in, and they share the risk. Third one is a partnership with this international organization. This international organization comes on the 3 ways. One is bringing the new knowledge and creating a knowledge partnership with the local institutions and the international institutions and also the financial windows. Finally, it is the regular review of approaches to revising this emerging and the legislative and the regulatory framework that support the social production, climate risk, and the inclusive growth. So these are the areas, and we are also currently working on measuring this readiness of this ASEAN 10 countries to embrace this new social platform that is created at the regional level as a part of Phnom Penh Declaration. So I stop here and I will come for other questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hanbu, for this very interesting presentation. So Dr. Hanbu is the Director of the Research, Strategy and Innovations at ERIA. Unfortunately, we are under time constraints, so I let you post your questions in the thread, specifying as far as possible to whom they're intended. And we will now listen to Garima Bala, who is an economist and social protection specialist, and Federico Spano, who is a social protection and resilience officer, both at FAO, and they are going to present their work on social protection and climate risk management in the context of agri-food systems. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me see if I can navigate. Okay, great, I can. Thank you, and both Federico and I are happy to be here today, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Now, Dr. Venkatachalam has really sort of focused on the ASEAN region, which is great. So just as a heads up, in our presentation, we're going to zoom out a little bit, and we'll talk about social protection and climate risk management conceptually, as well as some of the trends more globally, but we will also talk about some of the work in ASEAN. Now, I'll just take a brief 5 minutes to give a quick introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Federico to talk in more detail about the pathways in which social protection can help with climate risk management. So, I'm trying to see if I can move on to the next slide. Okay, great. So this is navigating well. Now, basically, we've already heard this before from the earlier presentations, that climate change is accentuating rural vulnerabilities. The point that we want to highlight over here is we want to look particularly at the peculiarities of rural populations. And we want to stress that these rural populations are already operating under several market failures. They have low access to land. They have low access to livestock. They are operating with low human capital. They have basic technologies, very limited modern inputs, and as was earlier mentioned, low access to public services. Now, this includes even social protection coverage, right? So these are the structural constraints within which rural populations are operating on a day-to-day basis. Now, what climate change and climate vulnerabilities and climate extreme events is doing, it's basically these structural constraints that these rural populations are operating under is getting reinforced because of climate change. So you find that climate change, as we know, it undermines natural resources, increases exposure to hazards. All of this leads to a loss of livelihood. A loss of livelihood, in turn, will lead to a decline in income and a decline in investment. Now, these declines that we see lead, in turn, to hunger and reduced diet diversity, reduced food security. There's immediate deprivation that these households are experiencing, and in order to deal with these constraints, these households then are also turning to negative coping strategies, such as selling their productive assets. They are also becoming more vulnerable to future risks, which then has an impact on their future income stream, and again leads to a loss of livelihoods. So it's like a perpetuation of poverty. It's the poverty trap that we have to now try to see how we can actually break this poverty trap. Now, in terms of the trends, I will not dwell more on this slide, but because we are all aware of this, it's already been presented that both hunger and climate change have been on the rise. We see that, of course, COVID has accentuated these trends, especially of hunger. We know that climate change is going to keep increasing given the state that we are currently in. The number of disasters has increased by a factor of 5 over the last 50 years. And most of these hazards have been drought, storms, flood. Most of these, it's climate change that is responsible for most of these disaster events. And most of them are impacting agriculture and agricultural related livelihoods. So that's the context, again, within which we are operating. Now, again, it's primarily impacting developing countries and the poor, globally speaking. So we find that over 75% of the world's extreme poor are in rural areas, and we know that these rural poor, their livelihoods depend heavily on natural resources and weather. And so, of course, they are disproportionately affected. We are aware the data has been collected. There are statistics on the extent of vulnerability that they're experiencing because of degraded agricultural land, because of increased desertification. So poor rural households really need to have the resources to adapt their production systems or to change their production systems to meet these challenges. But we find that they really very rarely have the resources too. And so this is really coming down to the crux of the conversation today, right, about just transition. So how do you actually make sure that they have these resources? Rural women in particular are very vulnerable. They have already low access to resources, information, and methods of adaptation. Again, this gets accentuated, and their time that they're devoting to tasks such as collection of fuel, bringing water, etc., again we see that time investment is increasing. So now, in terms of the question then really is how do we then fit agricultural transformation, this development model that we have been acquainted with historically in the past, how do we then really fit it into the hard constraints that is currently being imposed? So we see that it's not possible, as was in the past, to to expand land and to expand cultivation. There's a hard constraint on agricultural land expansion, and there is a need to reforest marginal areas. We see that there's a constraint on water availability. We see that there is a constraint on these various other agricultural related activities that are required. Biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of natural resources, again, we find that it's on a decline. So how do we then harness these resources? Again, this harks back to some of the points that Dr. Venkatachalam had made in his presentation. So now let's turn over. I'm going to hand it over to Federico, my colleague, to really understand how social protection can help us address some of these challenges. Federico, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Garima, and thanks everyone, to Wanda, Pascal, and Anbu, and all the other speakers today for inviting us to participate in this very interesting workshop. So here in this slide, you can see a little bit what is the result of a study that we did around 3 years ago, or actually 2 years ago, also together with Cecilia, that is going to present after me, and colleagues from ODI. So we have been looking at like the literature, but also promising and interesting practice that we found around the practice around the projects implemented by different actors, and also we informed the process with key informant interviews. Basically, our objective was to frame a little bit, and this is a word that has also been picked up recently by FCDO for this COP26. So to frame a little bit, what is the role of social protection in terms of contributing to climate risk management? So we cluster the pathways in which social protection can contribute into 3 channels, let's say. First one being the reduction of vulnerability and reliance on negative copy strategy. The second one is the promotion of the uptake of climate resilient or environmentally sustainable agricultural practices, and the last one is the support to inclusive emergency management operations. For obvious reason, we have been focusing mostly in rural areas and on the specific concerns of small-scale food producer, given the fact that we work for the Food and Agriculture Organization. So now I will briefly look into these 3 pathways. The first one I will just touch upon as is the most obvious one, because it's pretty much the actual job of social protection. So in terms of reduction of vulnerability, we have seen, especially from like a number of impact evaluation studies that have been implemented in the last years, that there is a role of social protection around risk management in terms of the diversification of income sources, adoption of climate smart technologies, and also enhanced participation in local social networks. Same in terms of human capital accumulation, in terms of food security, dietary diversity, and increased attendance in schools. There is an obvious impact on consumption stabilization and a reduction in negative coping strategies. What I would like to focus a little bit more is the second pathway, which is the uptake of climate resilience and sustainable livelihood strategies. So what we've seen is that social protection has the potential to serve as a key pillar for integrated programming. So where we do not have exclusively social protection, we don't look exclusively at social protection, but we see the role that social protection, and often especially social assistance, can play in promoting the uptake of climate smart practices, or in terms of adaptation and mitigation, which are promoted by ad hoc programming, where basically the role of social protection is mostly to increase inclusivity. Why? Because to say in really few words, small-scale food producers, which are often the main target of social protection program in LDCs, where we do not have universal coverage, are extremely risk adverse, because they have risk-sensitive livelihoods, because they have limited access to agricultural inputs, they have limited access to financial services, including saving schemes and insurance, and also limited access to market. So these make these specific category risk adverse, which means that the support to be given in order to uptake new agricultural practices needs to be extremely tailored in order to not only look at the economical aspects, but also at the behavioral change aspects. In terms of the solutions within this pathway, we have been looking at social protection as a tool to uptake climate resilience livelihoods, so adaptation-specific livelihoods. For instance, we are currently working in Malawi, where we are using the social cash transfer implemented by the government with the World Bank support as a basis to promote farmer field schools and geared towards like the uptake of resilient crops, providing farmer field school, which means basically technical training, focusing on agricultural elements and practices, but also financial inclusion aspects, and providing also targeted agricultural inputs, which means high quality seeds and sustainable fertilizers, for instance. Another element, is around mitigation. So reducing pressure on ecosystems. There is a number of examples around the globe where, for instance, social protection and specifically social assistance instruments have been using to decrease pressure on fish stocks. I think the fishery sector is extremely interesting for this. Indeed, there are a lot of examples. For instance, like seasonal fish bans or things like these. And this is extremely relevant because we know that climate change is forecasted to have a high impact on fish stocks in terms of decline, but also in terms of redistribution, and these will create problems to the small scale fisher folks rather than the big companies that will be able to hunt the fish also very much offshore. In terms of deforestation, there is an interesting example, which is Proeza from Paraguay, which I will present in the next slide. Another element is the building green infrastructure and supporting the provision of environmental services. This is the most obvious link between social protection and environmental protection, or like adaptation practices, because when we look at the tools which are cash for work on the social protection side and public works or payment for environmental services on the other side, we can see a very obvious link, which there are many examples. Even though I believe these specific elements bring us back to a quick questions that I would like to discuss later, which came to me immediately when I saw the title of this event, which is the issue of inclusion. Public works, cash for works are all programs that can be used for a specific subsection of those who are the typical social protection beneficiaries, which are the working able. And as some specific concerns also when we think about agricultural livelihoods, because obviously cash for work in rural settings needs to be implemented during lean seasons when people are not working on their own fields. Otherwise, we might create problems rather than solving them. But more importantly, I think this brings us back to the question of what is the role that the poorest of the poor, for instance, small-scale food producers, have to play in greening our economies. Why? Because obviously and this is very relevant for the just transition topic, because the amount of GHG emissions that are coming from their livelihoods is extremely limited. For instance, agriculture is estimated to contribute with 21% to GHG emissions, which is the second most impactful sector after energy with 47%, but the share of small-scale food producer is estimated to be around 5%. This means that if we found win-win solutions where we can have a decreased impact on the environment and also like pathways for economic inclusion and more economically sustainable livelihoods, this is great. If this is not the case, we should consider to focus very much on adaptation rather than mitigation when it comes to this specific category. In terms of examples, as I was saying, an interesting example of this kind of like programs that are designed with a win-win approach, which means basically multiple objectives, it's Proeza. Proeza is a program that is implemented in Paraguay, where basically the objective is to improve the resilience of the poor households impacted by climate change, and at the same time increasing the forest cover in the northeast of the country. Proeza is basically a program that has multiple components, and each component has multiple delivery mechanisms. For instance, within the component one, which is called Planting for the Future, there are a number of services which are provided that goes from training, capacity building, in support for investments in conservation agriculture, afforestation, and environmental conditional cash transfers. This last element is entirely built on the National Social Protection System, which is called Tecopora, where basically what has been used operationally is the social registry, so the data set that is used to identify people, poor people, and also the disbursement system, let's say. It's an interesting program because basically the objective finally is to support these small-scale food producers to switch to more sustainable agricultural practices, and this is done through the use of social protection as a financial incentives for the period that the new practices, which is basically planting and selling foods, is used for as a buffer, let's say, for the first years. Another example, which I think is interesting because it's not the typical social assistance work, is the Cadena Program, which is an insurance scheme specifically designed for small-scale food producers, where basically in Mexico, the federal government purchase insurance products, which are, I cannot really see my, okay, now I can see it, which purchase the insurance, which support the purchase of the insurance product for the federated state, which buy insurance bundle from Agrosemex, which is a public-private company, and also other private insurance. But finally, the payouts go directly to the farmers. In this case, small-scale food producer, even though the category small-scale food producer in this case is quite peculiar because we are thinking about farmers with less than 20 hectares. There is much more to say about this. We have a paper specific on the use of agricultural insurance product for small-scale food producers in the concept of social protection, which is called protecting livelihood, linking agricultural insurance and social protection. I can share with you the link later on if you want. In terms of the other pathway, I think this is something that I can just quickly touch upon because my colleagues will also mention it later. Is the fact that social protection can serve as an element to ensure inclusive disaster management when it comes to dealing with extreme events. We have different solutions of using existing social protection to deal with extreme events. On the one end, we can temporarily expand the coverage of social protection programs, so covering those who are near poor or they are vulnerable to poverty due to climate shocks for a very specific amount of time. We can increase the financial protection, so have a vertical expansion, providing additional resources to those who are already normally covered. And then we can obviously increase the comprehensiveness, which means to include additional services. In our case, for instance, agricultural assets and training in the recovery phase after an extreme events. What I would like to underline with this slide is that these type of scale-ups of stretching of social protection programs can happen in 2 points in time, basically. One will be right after a shock, or in any case during response and recovery phase. The other one will be before a shock hit or before a slow onset shock reaches peak. In this case, we will be talking about anticipatory action, and this is a growing practices where FAO is investing quite a bit, which obviously is very interesting, but brings a lot of complexity in the game, because basically we'll be thinking about using social protection to anticipate shocks, basing any type of like decision on the forecast of extreme events rather than the extreme events itself. In this slide, you can see the different type of scale-up options, which I mentioned already. What I wanted to underline is just the fact that social protection, it can be very interesting. We on the one hand can offer to national government the possibility to expand coverage and protection during shock time. On the other hand, can be a key element to ensure coordination with external actors, such as humanitarian organization or development organization that come into countries to complement what the government is doing. We have seen in the past a lot of problems of lack of coordination due to a role that has been played by international stakeholders that was potentially not appropriate with regard to the leading role of national governments. We have multiple examples. One that I think is very interesting now is the migration that has been triggered after the Haiyan super typhoon in the Philippines, because of the different rate of cash forward that they were offered by different organizations. So during like post disaster weeks, we had people migrating from one island to another to get better cash for work rates. So again, this can be done ad hoc. So for instance, Super Typhoon Haiyan is an example, or can be done by design. One very well studied example is the HSNP in Kenya, but there are a few others, obviously, which are nowadays starting to embed these shock response or shock anticipation features in their design. Before moving to what we're doing, I think one final word on the fact that there are a lot of elements that needs to be looked at when we talk about these things. I don't think now I will have the time to go into the details, but I believe that one, for instance, very interesting approach to do so is a paper that was published, I think, last year by Gabriel Smith and another colleague from the World Bank, looking at the delivery chain of social protection and how in each step of the delivery chain, from the intake to the exit strategy, like specific concerns regarding adaptation can be taken into consideration. So in terms of what we're doing in the region, as I was saying before, as FAO, in the next 2-3 years, we'll be focusing in this region specifically on this idea of anticipating climate shocks. So we have a 3-year partnership with DG ECHO from the EU. That will be focusing on 5 countries: Vietnam, Philippines, Laos, PDR, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, where in the next months we'll be implementing feasibility assessment, and hopefully we'll be facilitating the design of roadmaps in terms of like embedding anticipation aspects within social protection systems. This is something that it's already in the making in the Philippines, and we are starting in other 4 countries. We also set up country-level capacity development and coaching services, both for the national government, also partners which are interested in joining this work. And finally, we'll be pilot testing this approach. So using social protection to provide additional support right before a shock in the 5 countries during the first year. So 2022 will be potentially only simulating in some countries, because we have to do a few steps in order to get ready for that. But then for sure we'll be find occasion to test this in the next 2 years. In the few examples of the global work, we have an e-learning which are working on, again, also with Cecilia, which is called Managing Climate Risk Through Social Protection. We launched now at COP26 the first 3 lessons, which are already online, while we hope to have the entire course ready by the beginning of 2022. This is a self-paced course where everyone can enroll and take it when they want. We have with ODI a research on social protection and anticipatory action, which will be focusing mostly again Southeast Asia and Latin America, where we have other ongoing work in this area. And then we have one research that we're working on inclusivity and climate action, where again the point we'll try to make is as much as possible to understand where it makes sense to focus when we think about the small scale food producers. My last slide, just to point out that obviously social protection is not a silver bullet, for the reasons that the coverage is very different from country to country, and often when there is the highest level of risk, there is the lowest coverage. You can see here in the picture on the right that there are a lot of like Southeast Asia and Pacific countries on the extreme right, bottom right part of the diagram. So the other thing is that we are thinking about elements that have a very high level of complexity from the very technical and programmatic point of view, but also from the governance and financial point of view. And I believe my colleagues later will touch upon this. Is a very context-specific work, so there is no one size fit all like strategy that can work in one country that not necessarily can be replicated in other countries. Another thing which is linked to this is the fact that the level of maturity of the social protection system matter. We have to remember that social protection is a policy solution to support the poor and the most vulnerable to get better off and be financially included. So stretching these kind of programs for other objectives such as environmental protection or climate change adaptation needs to be taught very, very well. And finally, that even when we think this is possible, we cannot imagine social protection to substitute other solutions such as climate change adaptation, disaster management, or mitigation. Social protection has a role to contribute to make this more inclusive, but obviously not to substitute them. So I'll stop there. Apologies for taking slightly more time than I was given, and look forward to the discussion. Over.
Thank you so much, Garima and Federico, for this insightful presentation. So yes, we have huge time constraints, so don't forget to post your questions in the thread, and we will try to have a Q&A time at the end of the presentation, hopefully. So we'll now listen to Marie-Christina, presenting the work she carries out with her colleague Nuno Cunha, and more specifically ILO's approach to social protection and climate change and lessons learned from the region. So Marie-Christina is a social protection and climate change specialist in the social protection department of ILO, and Nuno Cunha is senior technical specialist on social protection, also in ILO. So the floor is yours, Marie-Christina.
Thank you so much, and good morning, or rather good afternoon for some of you. Really good to be here. Just to let you know real quick, my colleague Nuno is still traveling, so I'll be taking over his part of the presentation as well, but that's no problem at all. We prepared it together. So let me start with a quick overview, essentially, of the different elements, or rather linkages between social protection and climate change, as they were already discussed to some extent, but just to kind of systematically go through them. So first of all, social protection has a role to play in protecting people against current impacts of climate change, really looking at, both sudden onset, but also slow onset events. So you can see here on the left, that would be certainly a sudden onset, looking at flooding, etc. But then also the second picture, looking at more longer term adaptation efforts, something that Federico just referred to in quite a bit of detail, so I won't go into that too much. But we can also look at specific types of social protection programs that have both an adaptation and a mitigation role. So public employment programs, for example, would be one example where you can actually adapt to current and future impacts of climate change, but you can also actually contribute to capturing and storing carbon, and so actually also contributing to mitigation in that sense. And what's really important also to keep in mind, just to add an additional angle, is to avoid the negative impacts of a transition to a more sustainable economy and society, because many people may, fall between the cracks in the transition from one job to another. They may lose jobs in very carbon-intensive industries, and will actually have to. Sorry, so I want to just move the slide. We'll actually have to transition to more sustainable job opportunities. And so actually supporting people in this transition will be key. And one additional aspect then as well in this transition is also to actually promote that itself by, for example, offering more training and job opportunities as they relate to green or more sustainable jobs. And this can be done through a combination of social protection and also active labor market interventions. And so ILO's approach actually kind of structures it around these different areas. So, I mean, for one thing, the contribution of social protection to climate change adaptation, so protecting from current and future climate change impacts. And maybe just to add here, it's important to also consider that, we don't just work on preparedness and response as it relates to sudden onset events, but you can actually do a lot before any shock already hits. So looking at preventive aspects and also transferring risk. And so a really important instrument in that sense is actually the role that social insurance can play in that, looking at health insurance, looking at injury insurance, unemployment protection, etc. And then obviously moving after a shock also to the recovery phase where, it's not just coping as I think it was Anbu who said that earlier, but it's actually also using that as an opportunity to potentially actually rebuild better after an impact. And so the second big area, and as I said, some of these potentially overlap between adaptation and mitigation, is actually, what role social protection can play as part of climate change mitigation. And here we look at, including rehabilitation, restoration of landscapes and coasts, looking at conservation or also reforestation, for example, in social protection programs, which I think is a really important link to actually actively contribute to climate change mitigation, but then also some of the more promotive and transformative elements as it relates to a transition to a more sustainable economy and society. So really making that transition just in a way. And social protection can actually also help incentivize lower emissions or reduction or avoidance of emissions, the same way it can incentivize the move to green and formal jobs. And I think what is important to remember is that when we look at just the instrument of social protection in general, it is already in itself fulfills a function of actually protecting people from these kinds of impacts. It's different kinds of life cycle risks throughout the course of a person's life, be it health, be it unemployment, etc. So that is already in itself very helpful without any, potential modifications or climate change considerations in addition. And it's really important not just to look at, coverage as in how many people are covered, but I think as Federico showed with this nice cube, you're also looking at how adequately those different risks are covered, and also which types of risks are actually covered. And so I think that is a really important consideration when we look at climate change, that people just are increasingly at risk, different risk factors and also more frequently. And so maintaining the functionality of the social protection system throughout is really important. All right, going to essentially the different entry points We already talked about most of them. So the core function of social protection in the region, what's really important is that it can actually help reduce household debt, which is a huge problem in many households, also especially in rural areas. And it can support investments in maintaining livelihoods and also investing further. We looked at adaptation and mitigation already, so I won't go into too much detail. And I'll talk a little bit about the just transition aspects in a moment. Maybe just to say, I think what we need to consider when we look at the connection between social protection and climate change is that we cannot necessarily reach universality in social protection if we don't consider climate change mitigation and adaptation, because there'll just be additional risks and people will continue to require additional protection. But at the same time, we will also not actually achieve a sort of just transition to net zero if we don't consider social protection. Because what we've seen in many countries is, you implement green policies and you don't actually take into account several people who are groups of populations who are left behind in the process. And so the transition is not politically and socially acceptable. And so those measures are not necessarily sustainable. And so I think that's a really important connection to keep in mind as we go forward. All right. So looking at the regional challenges and megatrends, this is where I was supposed to hand over to my colleague from the region. So just to say, I'll do my best to fill in for him. We kind of discussed a little bit, what the megatrends are in the broader region, but also the sub-region of these 5 countries specifically, and maybe adding to a few of the points that Anbu already stressed earlier. So, one thing we see in this sub-region is a population growth. So in the basin by 2060, the estimates are around 83 million, so an increase of about 20%. We see urbanization as a continued trend, also due to these environmental factors in some of the rural areas. A large fraction remains strongly dependent on water resources, even in the cities, so irrigated agriculture, fisheries, etc. But these urbanization impacts also have consequences on how people handle risks. So people have less community support, they're smaller families, or there are also demographic issues, also in terms of aging. And we see big socioeconomic changes. Irrespective of COVID-19, we saw, a growing population, increasing wealth, which creates greater demand for water, energy, food. It drives land cover change, and with that come issues around water quality, coastal erosion, soil subsidence, etc. So that was irrespective of COVID-19, and now what we see is that COVID-19 is essentially exacerbating socioeconomic challenges and also inequalities. And then in addition, current climate change impacts, not just sudden, but also slow onset. So we see changes in river flow patterns, the flood frequency. We see an average temperature increase already, precipitation increase during the wet season, so around 13 to 15%, less during the dry season, especially in the south. There's an increase in flooding in all parts of the basin, and also more flash floods. So that's more the sort of sudden onset element there. And all of that is in turn then driving migration. And if we look at future climate change impacts, we see energy-related increases in emissions. So the estimate is actually between 2017 and 2040, so this was from a few years ago, increased between 34 and 147% in energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. So that is definitely something to take into account, not just in terms of global emissions, but regional. We see, when we look at the just sort of energy transition taking place, we need to take into account hydropower dams, also affecting fisheries, for example. A lot of these countries depend on hydropower. Laos is one of those. In Myanmar, Cambodia, we see an upward trend. And I think more in terms of like a downward trend in Thailand and in Vietnam as well, but overall across the board, rising electricity demand, so over 10% annually, I think right now. And what's really important then to see as part of this transition is to essentially continue to make the access to energy more affordable, but to also make it, you know, as clean and as socially acceptable as possible. And I think all of these 5 countries in the basin are challenged by, you know, not only meeting rapidly rising electricity demand, but also kind of adapting to the clean energy transition to minimize environmental impacts on the river system, and then in addition responding to different shocks and the COVID-19 pandemic. And we actually see that countries that have been affected by droughts and floods in the region in 2018, 2019, they actually experienced exacerbated impacts of the pandemic on society. And so I think that's also an important, you know, connection to keep in mind. All right, so from the regional trends, just a few numbers on social protection in the region that I think we also just kind of have to consider when we design interventions going forward. So just in terms of the overall coverage, when we look at the broader region of Southeast Asia, we actually see that coverage is still lower than elsewhere. So in the broader region, 44.1% with access to at least one social protection benefit, but Southeast Asia, we're at about 33.2. And maybe just, you know, compared to other parts of Asia, if we look at East Asia, for example, we're more in the category of about 72.3. So you see the difference quite clearly. Then also in terms of the effective social protection coverage, so looking at the different population groups, what may actually be interesting to look at here, I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to say, you know, we see high coverage on pensions, for example, but we see pretty low coverage for unemployed and children. And so those are often also very particularly vulnerable groups to climate change in terms of the direct and indirect or secondary impacts of it. And then one word on spending on social protection in the region. We see that it is very low. Countries continue to spend less than about 2% of GDP on social protection. The sort of regional average in Asia and the Pacific is about 7%. Global average is 11%. And if we look at countries such as the European Union, we're at about 18%. So you can see the differences quite clearly and very pronounced. One quick word on COVID-19, which my colleague asked me to also bring in here. There's some of the characteristics of COVID-19 responses in the region that are quite interesting to look at as lessons also for how we deal with climate change. So one of the things that was interesting was that we see if what can be done essentially if there is broad buy-in, political buy-in. So we see the rapid nature of the measures that were introduced. So it is possible to take action quickly. Recognizing and also filling to the extent possible existing coverage gaps. Trying new things, I think, was something that was very interesting to see across countries in the region, but also globally. So the diversity in terms of both the scale, but also the nature of responses. And I think now it'll be key to sustain this momentum and use the recovery to make both measures as well as the economy and society overall more sustainable. And there's actually a policy brief by the UN Secretary General specifically on COVID-19 recovery that looks at how we can actually use that for a greening of economy and society overall. And now going to the ILO work in the region. And here, bear with me because I'm just going to give you a broad overview because my colleague would have otherwise been able to go into much more detail, but also looking at the time. So 3 key points or types of interventions. So on the one hand, as you know, ILO is quite busy working on policies and strategies with countries in the area of social protection. So we have right now a comprehensive review of the social protection system happening in Thailand, in Mongolia, and in Cambodia. Across the Asian region, what is quite relevant here is that, in the past, we never necessarily looked at specific elements of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and that is changing. And so I think it's not necessarily what you do, but how you do it in order to make this link quite clear, and also look at how the system is performing in that sense. In Cambodia, there is currently a midterm review of the National Social Protection Policy framework happening. So that is an additional entry point where some of these elements can be reflected. In Laos, there's support to the design of a national social protection strategy happening right now. And in Vietnam, a so-called master plan on social insurance and social assistance, as well as a review of the social security law. So the legal elements kind of in behind the scenes are also quite a significant element for some of the things that we discussed. And then in terms of institutional support, there's support to the system modernization in Cambodia happening right now, looking also at management information systems, etc. And then in terms of specific program design, work on unemployment insurance in Indonesia and Malaysia, where I think we can draw quite a few lessons that may also be relevant for the 5 countries of the sub-region. And I think unemployment protection, especially linked to training opportunities, also for people to actually be enabled to move from higher, more carbon-intensive industries. For example, coal, if we look at Indonesia, is one key industry in that regard, to more sustainable or green jobs is quite important. And then I think there's also some additional work happening in Laos on mother and early child benefits to kind of close some of the coverage gaps that we perceived, especially in terms of these population groups. And that is it for now. I will hand over back to the moderator, but if there are any questions also related to the ILO work in the region and how we want to link it to climate change adaptation and mitigation in the future, we'll be happy to discuss those later also during the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Christina, for this very interesting presentation. So we will now listen to Cecilia Costella and Anna McCord, who will provide and present a framework and a way forward to scale up ambition on social protection and climate change. Cecilia is a consultant and specialist on social protection and climate with the University of Twente and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And Anna McCord is also a social protection specialist and an independent consultant. So the floor is yours, Anna and Cecilia.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. I'm Cecilia. I'll start and then Anna will join a bit towards the end. It's a pleasure to be here with old friends and new friends, not only among the presenters, but also I see in the audience as well. And we have the honor and the challenge to go last. You'll be surprised to know that we actually asked to go last. And the reason to do that is because first of all, because we wanted to zoom out. We wanted to zoom out from the region a bit, but also because we wanted to share with you a paper we did, which tries to bring some of these pieces of work that many of us have been working on for a while. And the reason we put together this paper is, hold on, let me just get my presentation right, was because we wanted to put together something that try and speak to the climate audiences, and we did this, in the run-up to COP, and it sort of helped inform some of the conversations at COP by FCDO and DFAT and the German Corporation, as well as the Climate Center. So here are the links to the paper if you're interested in. But why did we put together this paper? because we thought, okay, well, what are the challenges around linking social protection and climate change? Why do we need to link social protection and climate change? And so we wanted to start with climate change. And we wanted to acknowledge that, first of all, a new type of socioeconomic risk is emerging, that current disaster response, humanitarian action, adaptation and mitigation efforts are insufficient, and that because of this, we need a fundamental shift in the way that we deal with the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. So what do we mean by a new type of risk is emerging? We are seeing that climate change is not only to increase it's not only going to increase poverty, it's also going to make life more difficult for the non-poor as well. It's going to make new groups poor and vulnerable. And so it's, to relate to the question that Pascal posed at the beginning, it's not just an issue of supporting the poor, which is a very important goal even in and of itself of social protection, but not the only one. Current disaster response and humanitarian action is overwhelmed. Almost every year, humanitarian appeals are not fulfilled. There is not enough funding to support the amount of need in the humanitarian sphere. And with climate change, that's going to double. Adaptation efforts, you might have seen recently, there was a very important effort to consolidate what had happened on climate change adaptation efforts. Most of it has been ad hoc, fragmented, not strategic, essentially small projects. We need to move beyond that. And of course, mitigation measures, as has been highlighted already, climate change mitigation measures do not really have taken yet into consideration what are the impacts on people and what are we going to need to put in place in order to transition. So what climate risks are we talking about? I think a lot of the literature on social protection and climate change and disaster risk management has focused on this idea of extreme events, which are events that come out of the climate system, essentially natural hazards that are increasing because of direct effects of global warming. This is a very important part of the risk that we face from climate change, but it's not the only one. As it's also been mentioned, we need to consider slow onset events and stresses. What do we mean? We need to consider the gradual changes that climate change is going to bring about in the medium to long term, in the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years, and how that's going to affect livelihoods, how that's going to affect migration, how that's going to affect diseases. So these two challenges, both extreme events and slow onset events, arise from the climate system. But we also know that other drivers of risk, for instance, socioeconomic processes like policies for urban planning, agricultural policies, deforestation, migration, all of them also interact with climate change and increase poverty and vulnerability and decrease well-being. And finally, a part of those policies that we put in place are to address the impacts of climate change. So this is what we know as climate change mitigation and adaptation policies, or what we're calling here in this paper, climate change response measures. So these response measures will also have impacts on poverty, vulnerability, and well-being. So when we look at the role of social protection to address climate change or the socioeconomic impacts of climate change, this is what we're thinking about. We're not just thinking about the specific shocks, but we're thinking about the challenges that arise from slow onset events, from socioeconomic processes, including those that we're putting in place because of climate change. What is the role of social protection in that space? We decided in the paper that there were 4 roles, and the 2 of them were actually what we think are the core role of social protection, and then that there are 2 that are complementary roles that social protection can play in addressing some of the impacts of climate change. So the 2 core roles are the well-known role of social protection in reducing poverty and vulnerability per se, but also the new more widespread practice of protecting people from the immediate impact of large shocks, not just individual life cycle shocks, as social protection has traditionally done, but also large shocks, especially climate-related shocks. Supporting adaptation and mitigation are important objectives of social protection, or important possible functions of social protection, but they will be complementary to some of the core efforts of social protection. And it's the same with supporting the climate transition. At least this is what we argue, but happy to discuss more on this. We also argue that none of this is going to happen without the intentional and strategic integration of climate change considerations into social protection policies, social protection systems, social protection programs. And then we review as well what is the evidence for each of these functions and why it matters for climate change. So I'm going to walk you through this relatively quickly, because we've already touched on some of this in the other presentations and we don't have a lot of time. But the first function of social protection is to reduce poverty and vulnerability ex ante, before shocks in general. So we know, of course, that social protection increases incomes and consumption, and that helps reduce vulnerability. There is a large body of evidence that shows that social protection reduces poverty, increases food consumption, especially when it's done through established cash transfers or established programs that provide regular benefits. And here, of course, we're focusing mostly on social assistance, right? But social insurance also has a function of, smoothing consumption and stability. So why does this matter for climate change? Well, first of all, because building resilience ex ante just helps people deal with the impacts of climate change in any form. And there are actually some studies that already show that this is true, that people that do receive regular benefits through social protection programs in some countries in Africa, for instance, are more prepared to deal with climate-related shocks. And the other core function of social protection is to support improvements in human development outcomes. So both through conditional and conditional cash transfers, and incentivizing behaviors that are related to health, nutrition, school enrollment, and closing the gender gap. So again, there is a significant body of evidence that social protection can do this. And again, this is important because overall resilience helps us deal with climate change. Protecting from the immediate impact of shocks, as we have seen in COVID, but also as we had already been testing, and Federico explained a bit about the work that's been done on this before, social protection has recently focused very much, or the development practice of social protection has recently focused very much on this idea of using social protection systems to scale up, to provide responses to shocks, either in anticipation or or after the shock happens. There is a large body of practice on this, especially after COVID-19. And actually, the evidence, I would argue that is smaller, in the sense that we actually don't know what are the long-term impacts of this type of interventions in terms of protecting people, beyond sort of the consumption smoothing right after the shock. This, of course, matters a lot for climate change, because we will see an increase in shocks. And this is the area where the development agenda around social protection and climate change has developed the most, so where there's been more interlinkages, at least from our perspective. And social protection also can help reduce disaster risks through, for instance, public works programs that have both an objective of supporting people, but also building assets that reduce disaster risk. Again, I think you might be familiar with the evidence on this. There is mixed. Essentially, if the public works programs are not well designed, then they might actually have negative impacts. So this is an area where there is potentially a lot of work to do in improving both policy and program design around linking social protection and climate disaster risk reduction. Then supporting climate change adaptation and mitigation, social protection helps improve employment and livelihood opportunities. Federico spoke about this in the context of rural livelihoods, but I think also in the context of more urban livelihoods, we see that, for instance, employment programs, reskilling programs can have this role, and this is key both for adaptation and mitigation, because improving and transforming people's livelihoods will help them adapt to the challenges from climate change. I think the evidence in this area is slightly more limited, but still very promising. And there are large studies that show that social protection combined normally with other interventions, for instance, the graduation approaches or the cash plus approach that Federico spoke about, do have this function. And the other aspect of social protection that contributes to climate change adaptation and mitigation is the behavior and change sort of incentives that it can provide. For instance, through payment for environmental services type of programs that can both support people that do not have resources, for instance, to take care of environmental assets or to support natural resource management in their context. There is a limited body of evidence around this, but it's very promising. There are examples from Mexico, Brazil, Paraguay, as Federico spoke about Proesa already. But I think the interesting aspect of these programs in the context of climate change is that they do focus on incentivizing behaviors that are that have positive outcomes for environmental management. And then finally, supporting the just transition, which we've also talked about quite a bit. But so two key contributions that I wanted to highlight here are the idea that social protection can compensate for losses caused by climate change measures. So when we put in place climate change adaptation and mitigation measures that have negative consequences for people, there can be compensation through social protection programs, as is the case, for instance, in China, where forest loggers were compensated for bans that were put on logging in the forest. There's also been some work around this, actually, both in developed and developing countries. But one example from Peru shows that essentially putting in place a cash transfer to protect people from the negative impacts of the fuel subsidy removal can actually not only support and protect those people, but reduce poverty. Again, this is a nascent area of work, especially in international development circles. And this, of course, matters a lot for the just transition agenda. And finally, I think something that has been mentioned a little bit is this idea of social protection improving both governance and networks and community networks and social capital. We think this is an important role of social protection. We've seen the cousin of social protection, right? In developed countries, welfare systems and social security systems have this role in the past, where they've provided a larger base for a sort of a new social contract between people and society. We think this is going to be incredibly important in the context of climate change. It's something that is not, at least we have not seen a lot of work done around this. Social protection programs in developing countries have often not focused on this, but an important aspect as we move in this transition to more sustainable economies. Very briefly, some of the gaps and challenges that also have been highlighted: low coverage and financing of social protection. Of course, none of this can happen, as Federico said, if we don't scale up investments on core social protection systems that are also shock responsive. Another challenge that we really tried to highlight recently at the COP was the low integration of climate in social protection policies, but more importantly of social protection approaches in climate policies. For instance, no NDCs or very few national adaptation plans or social protection policies, climate policies recognize social protection at all. So there's a lot of work to do there. And then at a more programmatic level, climate risk information and climate risk are not significantly yet integrated into the design of social protection programs. For instance, in targeting models or systems, in data management systems, and linkages with early warning. So a lot of work to happen on that operational space. Anna, if you want to take this last couple of slides, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, lovely. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, everybody. It's lovely to see you. I think it's nice at this stage to reflect on what we've heard and what is actually needed for the future. What are the implications of the analysis that Cecilia just set out? And I think our broad conclusion is that we really need to have a much bolder policy vision, a much greater degree of ambition for integrating climate change and social protection. And what we've seen is that in the past, at points of major economic and social dislocation, you have seen a significant shift in the nature and scale of social protection provision. And I think what we're saying is that now we need to recognize that this is a similar moment when you've got massively expanding need for provision, and we need to match that with an increased vision. And what this means is moving away, for example, from project-based, geographically focused interventions to looking much more systematically at the whole question of the expansion of provision, and actually looking at social protection as a mainstream national and transnational policy response to climate change. So I appreciate we're already out of time, so I'll just very briefly highlight the issues that we think are needed to take this forward. One is to really invest in the expansion of core social protection provision. The need for ongoing provision to address chronic poverty is going to expand massively in the next 30 years. So the first issue is expanding coverage, and that entails really investing in systems development. And I think this came out very clearly from the analysis over the last year. We need to look at management information systems, registries, payment mechanisms, and there needs to be a consolidated investment in these kind of systems to enable core provision to expand, and also continued investment in looking at this shock responsive capacity. But if we want shock responsive capacity, we have to really enhance core provision, because as several people have mentioned, coverage, particularly in lower income countries, is extremely low currently. So we're in a very poor position in terms of wanting to do a shock responsive response to climate change unless we can expand those basic systems. So of course we need to increase financing. Opportunities for domestic resource mobilization are quite low. So we have to be looking at how we can mobilize new resources. Can we link into climate change financing? Can we engage much more with loss and damage? Can we look at some of these kind of innovative insurance-based mechanisms that are being developed? So we really need to think about that. We also need to use climate risk information and climate response metrics in our social protection programs, because we need to know what we're doing at the moment. Is it effective? What kind of climate response outcomes, what kind of welfare outcomes are we seeing from climate-related social protection? As we said, we've seen today all this innovation that's happening, but we need to really understand what the impacts are and which of these programs are most effective and could be scaled up. And I think that the fifth area is to really adopt innovative and strategic coordination across sectors, because at the moment we're still operating very much in silos. And I think the current challenge needs to bring together environmental policy, climate change policy, and social protection. And again, there are some innovations happening in this area currently, but we really need to look at that. Cecilia, can we have the last slide? Thank you. And I think what we tried to sum up what needs to happen in order to sort of focus our own thinking, and we wanted to share this with you. But our feeling is that we need to really change the discourse. We need to have a shift in ambition, and we need to have a significant change in terms of policy and programming that we have in terms of social protection and climate change. We need to build on the knowledge we have. We need to look at the innovative programs that have been developed, many of which we've heard about today in the region. We need to disseminate that knowledge. We need to look at which programs are really effective. We also need to have improved knowledge about the scale of the problem. We know there's going to be massive increases in migration, so we need to be thinking about transboundary, transnational social protection once again. This was very much discussed decades ago, but we need to bring that back onto the agenda. So we need to understand both the nature of demand over the next 30 years, but also we need to learn about the programming innovations that have taken place and disseminate that learning. So we need to really engage in advocacy within our own community of practice and intersectorally. And in terms of advocacy in the community of practice, I just wanted to draw your attention that just last week, the USB 2030 group on social protection and climate change was formed. So I think we're starting to create this epistemic community of practice here, which is excellent. And I think the other issue, as I mentioned, is financing. And there we really do need to be thinking about innovations, because currently we're in a very fiscally constrained environment. Donor countries are constrained. Many developing countries are struggling to even maintain their existing social protection provision. So again, we need to think radically about what the options could be there. And again, moving beyond project-based financing to looking at much broader national and international financing strategies for expanded provision. I think I'll leave it there. We go into these issues in much more detail in our paper, but these are really the highlights that we wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia and Anna, for this very interesting presentation. And thank you all for your interest and for your questions. I see our presenters have answered most of them. So thank you so much. Maybe there is one more left for Dr. Ambu from Lynn. We can take a few minutes if you want to answer. And then we'll move to the roundtable, which promises to be rich in discussion. So I strongly encourage you to participate and share your ideas through the discussion thread. And I let Dr. Ambu answer to Lynn's question. Thank you so much. I think Dr. Ambu is not with us. So maybe Etienne?
Yeah, as Anna suggested, that we had a very dense set of presentations, also very inspiring. We could take a few minutes break. I think that's reasonable. Let's say that we meet again at 11:15, right? Okay. I have 11:10 right now, so in France, so 11:15. So in just four minutes, we open the discussion for the roundtable, and finally we can really discuss between us, discuss together. So let's meet in 3-4 minutes now. All right, so we might want to start again for the very last session. Thank you, Anda. Lynn, Alexandre, Garima, Federico, Anna, and Marie-Christine. So all right, so we have Sarah and Cecilia. Maybe let's wait for a few seconds more. So first, maybe coming back to the whole set of presentations we had so far, I wanted to thank you all, because I think they all of them provide with different kinds of insights within the theme of the day, which is really all these links between social protection and environmental protection. And I think it might be useful to come back to the first presentation of Alexandre and Pascal and maybe build on their conceptual graph, right? I don't know, Alexandre, if you can share the presentation and just the conceptual graph. Can you do that? Because from my understanding of what has been presented in the second session, we had Eria talking a lot about the social conditions in Southeast Asia, the link with how environmental pressures and conditions would affect these social conditions. Some examples of social protection mechanisms as well, and the dynamic between environmental pressures and the social protection. So we had these dimensions analyzed. FAO did showed us some example of specific social protection related to food security, hunger, poverty. So that's a very specific scope of social protection. Looking also at agriculture as a key enabler of mitigation dynamics, and so that's where the link really occurs according to FAO. And then we had the ILO looking, I think what was interesting at the how social what would be the social consequences of environmental protection, and that's, I think, maybe a topic that was not so much analyzed so far. We just had COP26 in the last 2 weeks and new net zero promises at the horizon of 2050. So this aspect of how these new climate objectives, if they are seriously implemented, would drive and completely change the social conditions in Southeast Asian countries is absolutely a key topic. And of course, I think that's very, very strong argument in favor of developing further social protection. So ILO talked specifically about that as well. And we had, I think, a very nice last presentation as well, calling for also proposing a conceptual framework as well, but also calling for a very more systemic change, a bold vision, which of course has to be confronted to potential political difficulties and bottlenecks in the way it could be implemented in a region such as Southeast Asia. So to sum up, almost all of the links that of the arrows that Pascal and Alexandre and Lynn have put there have been highlighted in a way or another through the second session's presentation. So I think it's really interesting to try to now take stock of this and see how we could build a more prospective view of this nexus let's say in the next few decades. So I will ask you a few set of questions, and the same questions I suggest, and then of course you can choose the questions you want to answer more specifically. But these questions will really help us, I think, go further in a more prospective manner. So the first one will be really back to the basics, defining according to you the specific scope of social protection in a net zero or nature friendly, let's say, trajectory on the one hand, and in a high pollution, high impacts trajectory on the other hand, which are still the two worlds that could occur in the next decades for us. So that would be the question of scope in two very different worlds. The second question would be about budget macroeconomic issues, specifically in the context of Southeast Asia. So let's say we take the systemic bold vision of the last presentation. What does it imply, according to you, in terms of complete transformation into of the macroeconomic framework for emerging or low-income countries, such as the one in Southeast Asia? Third question is more related to the socio-political conditions that should evolve to enable such a transformative change, also specifically in the political and socio-political context of Southeast Asian countries. And the fourth one is, let's narrow down from these broad vision, and if you have the experience, and I know some of you have this geographical experience on Southeast Asian countries, what would be one or two geographies where it would be actually specifically interesting to analyze deeper this nexus, because they represent, let's say, two extreme cases, or two very specific cases, different with different characteristics. So I leave the floor to you. Four very different questions, but I think they are all key to build a more prospective assessment to this transformation. So, of course, I don't know who wants to start, who may want to start, but the floor is yours.
May I make a framing point, please, Etienne?
Sure.
I think it would really help to concentrate our minds if we think about this in terms of geopolitics and geopolitical stability, because what we're liable to see is significant increases in both internal and transboundary migration in the region. We're probably going to see the growth of increasing growth of urban slums. We're going to see economic dislocation. So the context will be one of social and potentially geopolitical instability. And so I think if we place it within that context, that would be really helpful, because then that will enable us to see it from a regime perspective. You know, what does it mean to governments, and what actually are the policy pressure points which they're needing to address? So it might be just useful bearing that in mind, because I think that's a very likely scenario. So the more we can start to think about it from that perspective, I think that will really focus our thinking. Thank you. You may not want to take that perspective, but I think it's useful just to bear in mind.
No, it's completely irrelevant. Actually, when I with a slightly different point, when I talked about the budget macroeconomic context, of course, this context is very much international. So with a different angle, I'm all in favor of considering these transboundary issues. And at the Southeast Asian region level, it's very, very relevant indeed, and even more for the lower Mekong countries. So
Can I come in and sort of build on that point from Anna, but I think also linking it to your first question, Etienne, because you were asking, what would be the scope of social protection in this sort of two different scenarios, right? In a scenario where we do actually move very quickly towards a kind of a net zero sustainable economic model, and we're all kind of like going towards that, or maybe perhaps the model that Anna was presenting, a more sort of grim picture where we actually do not put in place the measures and the policies that we need to put in place very quickly, and then we are headed towards a kind of scenario of destabilization and sort of strong geopolitical pressures. But I was thinking, actually, I think the need for social protection in both scenarios and the scope for it is very high, but for different reasons. And if you think of the first scenario where you have, we all decide tomorrow we're moving to a net zero, just transition, sustainable economic model, then I think you would see this, I don't know if you can see it, but this need for social protection going like this, and perhaps, eventually just coming down, because I think that we're going to need a lot of additional inputs if we are going to move to that new sort of economic model. And this is, I think, the core of what we're talking about when we talk about social protection's role in the just transition, right? How do we both, kind of eliminate poverty, but also support people not in poverty towards a transition? And then it's a very steep curve, a very large amount of need very quickly, and perhaps then it can stabilize. I think in the other scenario, it's just, we might continue in the path that we're on, and slowly every year kind of increase coverage of social protection by 1 percentage point or 2, and then, but when we get there, when we get to that scenario of destabilization, of significant, pressures, socio-environmental pressures, then the need for social protection is still going to be very high, and it's probably going to be larger and maintained for a longer time. So, I don't have any evidence of this, but I think it'd be really interesting to actually, this is one of the things that we were talking about with Anna when she said, in her presentation, the things that we need to know. We need to know what, these different scenarios are going to look like in terms of demand and need of social protection, and we don't yet.
If I can add on these,
and Marie-Christine after that, yeah, Federico. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Is there a way we can book ourselves to speak in this platform?
Let me check. I'm not an expert on this one.
Okay,
not sure. No, so
okay. So I will be quick, and I'll try to build on what Cecilia was saying, and also try to answer to your first question. I think that the first things that we have to look at, and that's why, the issue of green solutions, it's just part of it, in my opinion, is the fact that the climate is changing now. No, it's we have prospects of 1.5, 2.5 degrees in a certain given time, but climate change is changing now. And for those, for instance, involved in agriculture and any type of livelihood that has to deal with natural resources, the change are already happening. And so the amount of poverty that will be created by this changing climate, without looking at 2050, but looking at tomorrow and at today, it's huge. I remember a paper from Hellgate that was presented at COP in Marrakesh, which was 2016, if I'm not mistaken. No, it was he had some estimates saying that there would have been additionally 100 million of poor people pushed into poverty because of climate change. I remember people were like, "Wow, I mean, this is huge, no?" Now, looking at that estimate, I think that's optimism now. I mean, it's super optimistic estimate. I would love to see only 100 people push into poverty because of changing climate by 2030. I think will be a success, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be much worse. So, to go back to your first question, I think the main amount of focus should be on keeping social protection system functioning in this new challenge of changing climate, which means system strengthening, basically, without adding too many fancy features, but just like making sure that there will be the capacity to meet the increased caseload, and there will be the instruments to deal with a type of poverty which will be much more complex to tackle, because won't be only income poverty, but will be also poverty deriving from extreme events, but also slow onset. So again, we can look at integrated programming with climate change adaptation and mitigation. I think that's great. It's the way to go, but we have to be extremely cautious of what the priorities are going to be, because systems are struggling now to function in LDCs, and we have to be realistic and think about what's going to happen in the next few years. Over.
Thank you. So you answered both the first question and a little bit of the political feasibility question as well. So and jumping on Cecilia's timing issue of the two potential scenarios for development of social protection, which were very insightful as well. Marie-Christine, you wanted to...
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, it actually builds quite nicely on both Cecilia's and Federico's points. Maybe just on the COP22 agreements, 26 agreements now, where we kind of arrive at about, if we calculate 1.8 to 2.4 degrees of warming. I think we need to consider, if we look at 1.8, that is really if all of the commitments that have been made will be implemented, and we know that that's not very likely. And so I think when you look at those two scenarios that you talk about, I mean, very likely we're going to be on one end rather than the other. And I do think what we'll end up seeing is not just necessarily one or the other, but rather within different societies and also between regions, we will see quite significant disparities. So we'll see geographic disparities. So some are going to move towards a more, just transition, whereas other countries and other regions may actually going to, have to invest a little bit more in the sort of coping element of it. We'll see differences between informality and formality. And so right now, if we look at the informal sector in a lot of these countries that we've been talking about, it is still quite significant. And we know that informal workers are going to be affected a lot more. We see differences in gender disparities as well. So women often being also more informally employed, part-time, etc. So those are also different effects within often the same context. And we'll also see even, within the region that some countries may forge ahead more than others. And so I think I very much support Anna's point as well on looking more at regional solutions, because we see, national adaptation plans are very much at national level, nationally determined contributions, etc. Social protection policies don't necessarily take into account, any sub-regional issues. And so I do think that is something that specifically for this region will be increasingly important. If you ask the question about the scope and or the scale of social protection in either of these scenarios, I think Cecilia, I agree with you as well that I think the need will be the same for now. I think if we move towards increasingly universal systems, it'll do good in both scenarios, in both types of contexts. So I think the message there is pretty much clear. Also responding to the second question, we will need to see higher spending on social protection in the short to medium term. Especially in these countries where spending is about 2%. I think that is unavoidable if we really want to see the benefits that we've been talking about today in the workshop. I think the instruments will slightly differ depending on the scenario we're talking about, depending on the population groups we're talking about. Because, on the one hand, the closer we get to net zero, as Cecilia was saying, the more we need to discuss also changing skill sets, how we actually support the transition between jobs. The transition to a more sustainable economy will produce some jobs with low to mid-level skills, but we'll also see increasingly high level and specificity of skills needed. So I think that is something that is particularly important in that transition to net zero. Whereas I think the role of social assistance specifically will be needed either way. I think there'll always be people who at least temporarily fall through the cracks. I think we'll see that worldwide, even in countries where we have a national just transition plan, where we have increasing spending, even within EU countries, of about 18% on social protection. We see that some people are kind of left behind in the process. And I think that is something to keep in mind for these different scenarios. And then social insurance is equally important in both scenarios. I think we look at temporary unemployment, health issues, pensions, those life cycle risks will also always be there. Obviously, they will differ in terms of how often, frequency, severity, depending on how the environment changes. But I do think the mechanism of social insurance will continue to be quite relevant in both scenarios. And yeah, maybe just to say, I would be very interested to actually take the discussion a bit more towards the integration of different policies, because we've been talking about social protection policies on the one hand and climate change adaptation and mitigation on the other. But I think that's the same sort of silo dynamic we get in national contexts, that those are not necessarily brought together, neither at national nor at regional level. And so I think that would be quite an interesting point to take forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marie-Christine. Two contributions from Garima and Dr. Ambou. Maybe if Garima, you allow, we talk with Dr. Ambou first, as the regional question was very heavy in the latest intervention. So you may have the Asian point of view there. And your microphone is muted. So.
Thank you. I'll try to address your first, second, and the last question. One is on the scenarios. Indeed, that if you look into this region, ASEAN, and it is very diverse, and it is very difficult to distinguish the problems and the solutions. There is a common challenges. But one thing is clear, and the speed at which these economies are growing is very high, and they are putting more population under the risk, and that is the first part. And second thing is in the scenario buildings, and we often miss the climate change is the only issue, but it is not the case. And here we do have the climate change, and also we have the second generation of the environmental problems like a pollution that is very much putting the people under the vulnerable to the health risk. And third is also land use changes. So for example, deforestation is happening not because of drive for the prosperity, but escape from the poverty. And so here the scenarios are complex. But if you look into this region, and what is happening is inequality. I think inequality between the urban and the areas, and also rural areas, and agricultural areas, and the industry sector. So here most of this recent growth is coming from industry sector. So how this agriculture sector and the industry sector and the service sector combine together, and how this new regime of social protection policies evolve, that matters for the scenario analysis. And my second part is the macros, and to be look into deep, and countries are particularly the countries in the CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. The fiscal space available for universal social protection is very much limited, and the country's fiscal space is very narrow, and the tax returns are narrow. So here we need an innovations, and that innovations could come from a partnership with the private sector, which is very much reluctant into moving to countries. So we have some kind of a new model, and where these bottom of pyramid models could be promoted to have the kind of universal social protection platforms. And my third intervention on the geopolitics. Here we do have that regional frameworks, that is the ASEAN Social Community Framework and the ASEAN Economic Community frameworks are available. And so far these frameworks, that is the regional level, are kind of elite process, basically done at the top-down model. And here we need to engage more civil society and the local governments to bring the social protection platforms to become universal. I think this is one area where much more effort has to be done. And another geopolitics is kind of external partners with the ASEAN member countries. This region has benefited very much from this open regionalism policies, which invited the investments in selected sectors and also the infrastructure connectivity programs. Some countries worked very well, and some countries also it created an inequality within the population. And this population, this kind of ODA and FDI policies also need to be looked in, and they need to be aligned with these national policies and also the regional investment programs. And this is where area we need to look into it, and more policy integration and also long-term strategies are needed. Stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these 3 points. I think the international context, even beyond the ASEAN region, is also crucial, as it drives, of course, or it constrains a lot the space for developing such social protection policies, and the point of ODA and FDI aligns with some common rules, regulations, or principles is indeed a key element. So now maybe I give the floor to Garima. Garima, you wanted to?
Sure. Thanks, Etienne. So I actually wanted to just unpack this this notion of system strengthening. No, now I think there is consensus that that's extremely important, and that I think most people here, most of the discussions that I've participated in earlier as well, there's very much now in these circles an increased focus on systems strengthening, and rightfully so. So I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. So of course, there's one part of system strengthening is of course to strengthen the social protection system, right? So if you have, what are your registry systems that are operating in the country? How do you make it scalable, and questions along those lines. The other part of systems perspective, which has, I think, again, the previous two speakers addressed, is of course this notion of how do we align social protection policies with other sectoral/development policies. So here again, the point of coherence, like coherent policies and how they are working together in an integrated manner, becomes extremely important. So yes, they're important, and a lot of people, we all agree that they're important. Now, what can we do about this? We know that political will is extremely important, but we also know that while it's necessary, it's not sufficient. So some of the other constraints that we face, which goes beyond political will, is about capacity issues at the local level. So that's something that needs to be addressed. Now, of course, political will in turn can address capacity issues, both at the meso level and at the local level, but that's something to take into consideration. Now, one aspect I wanted to introduce here, which is very interesting to me, is that while we keep saying, look, these are the constraints under which that we work in, can we also think how social protection can actually help to build institutional capacity right from the local level, right? So I think this is a question that I actually want to spend more time in the future sort of thinking about. How are social protection policies and programs in various countries actually helping to build and strengthen institutions at the local and the meso level, and sort of instead of the direction going from top down, are actually helping to build these platforms and demand that more should be spent on social protection, that policies should take a certain shape and form. So that's a question that I think we need to think about. This again will, I think when we think about that question, we sort of have to go back at, and in the context of climate change, to get back to it, is to think about some of the local movements and how they, in these countries, have addressed issues of environment. I think that should be an interesting area to look for answers to the constraints that we know exist. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Garima. If I understand your point on the social protection as an enabler of local capacity building, I understand your point as in a way a defense of the notion of commons for social protection, right? So that's of course something we are very attached to at IFD. Let me give the floor to Onda for a quick intervention as well.
Yes, thank you. One thing, Guillermo was talking about the demand, and I think that one thing that we haven't touched too much upon is exactly the demand for social protection and how the quality of the social protection services has a huge impact on it. I mean, we see it especially, well, here in South Africa, but I don't doubt this is also the case in some of the countries in Southeast Asia, of people dropping out of the public services because the quality of these, therefore reducing the demand for public services and increasing the regressivity of social spending as a whole. So I think that this is also something that we should look into, how to increase the willingness to participate in social protection and the solidarity that was mentioned. And another point that I want to mention is also something that we see a little bit as donors, is that we need to stress that social protection is not a burden. It's not, it should be seen as an investment. It's not just a spending that is there and that needs to be filled. It can be a driver of growth, and therefore we need to also approach it a little bit differently, maybe. That was it.
Thank you, Onda. So I see Federico, Dr. Ambu, maybe Lynn or Alexandre and Pascal. You may want also to jump in. So Federico first, and then we finalize the loop.
If there is anyone that didn't
And
speak
Marika.
before, I'm happy to wait my turn, huh?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. No, just to say that, like, reflecting a little bit on your second and third question, I think that for the socio-political condition to develop integrated programming, the political commitment has been mentioned already. That's obviously key, but I think that also on top of that, it's important to consider regional and national level governance. ASEAN, for instance, is a partner of ours. We work a lot with them, with the Secretariat and the different representatives. But then one issue is the governance. It was like, what is the power of ASEAN as a Secretariat to actually then ensure policies are moved at country level, right? So that's one element. At the same time, when we think about federal governments, it's important to look at the different levels and understand very well from the outset of any type of intervention the power dynamics between the different levels. The other thing that has been mentioned already is the maturity of social protection systems, focusing on system strengthening and increase of coverage. And after this is taken into account, we can look at integrated programming. But what I wanted to touch upon is the enabling environment also. That is a very important element that sometimes it's overlooked, in the sense that in any type of social protection, many steps of the provision of support is delivered by public-private institution or private institution. So it's important sometimes, rather than focusing on other elements, to look specifically at what can be done in order to create this enabling environment. For instance, in the work on agricultural insurance, which in our research we've been framing a lot as an element of social insurance for those who are self-employed in the agricultural sector, the key issue is the enabling environment. So the willingness of private insurance firms to design products which are specifically designed for small-scale food producers, which have a very limited amount of financial literacy and limited capacity to contribute to insurance premiums. So there, the role of the government is key. Now, this is just an example, but this applies to everything. No, it's like a lot of time when we try to top up social assistance schemes with simply cash transfers, we struggle as a FAO, but also other organizations, UNICEF, WFP, to find reliable financial service providers, including those who are already serving the national cash transfers. An example is from the Philippines, where we have the 4P, which is a flagship program, which is well known to anyone and very well studied. When you go to the local level in some islands, in some part of the countries, there are very few financial service providers which, for instance, still use paper-based data sets and they provide cash over the counter, cash in an envelope to end beneficiaries. So I think these are elements that really it's important to look at. In terms of the financing and the budgetary element, I think we already mentioned climate finance as a key source, hopefully, even though until now very limited attention has been given to social protection and the link between let's say mitigation adaptation efforts and poverty reduction. But what I wanted to say is also that in ASEAN specifically, a lot of focus in terms of linking financial instruments has been placed on disaster preparedness and response. So in ASEAN, my sense is that much more focus is on the protective element, the protective function that social protection can play to increase in extreme climate-related events. And this is because, as someone has mentioned before, it's the region where there is a highest incidence of climate risk. And so I think that's where the focus will be. On the other hand, we all know that a lot of time, the focus between disaster risk reduction and disaster response is extremely unbalanced from the financial point of view. Very simply because politically it's much easier to say, okay, next year we will invest in disaster risk reduction. This year we'll focus on the response, and this is pushed year after year, right? And it's very complex from the political point of view to say, okay, now let's decrease funds for disaster response while extreme events are increasing, because we need to invest for future risk reduction. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Federico. Marie-Christine, then we have Lynn, and Dr. Ambou, you wanted to have a point as well, just to see where we go, because that's the last round of interventions. So Marie-Christine, Lynn, Cecilia, Alexandre and Pascal, and Dr. Ambou, and then we will be over time, I'm sure.
Many thanks. I'll be very quick. I wanted to actually answer your fourth question because you haven't received many responses to that one yet. Before I do, just a quick comment on Federico's intervention. I do think we see a strong focus on disaster risk management in the region, more on the adaptation side. But we also know that adaptation will not be enough to counteract the impacts, especially on poverty, food security, etc. So I think what we see is, a needed push. Also, when we look at the emissions, the way they go up in the region, I mean, we need to look at both elements. I was just looking at, to actually respond to your question on the country, the list of countries that actually have committed to formulating national plans for a just transition globally, and it's a list of about 50 countries for now. I think the list that I have here is from late last year, and it is very pronounced that there is no country from the region on this list. So we see European countries, Central Latin American countries, the Caribbean. We see some from Central Asia, but I think other than Samoa, not even coming close to the region. And so I do think that is something where all of us, I think, have a lot more advocacy, evidence building, and really driving that agenda forward, specifically in the region. I think there are some countries where work is starting. So I was going to give you the example of Indonesia, which I thought would be an interesting example to study, because starting from a sort of traditional relief response function in the past, I think following the financial crisis, there was a bit of a shift towards more of a mechanism for mitigating the impact of climate change, looking at reductions in energy subsidies, also rerouting some of those quote unquote savings to expand social assistance, although the fiscal space created was not necessarily, absorbed by social assistance primarily fully. But now the country is coming out with an adaptive social protection roadmap. There's quite a bit of unemployment protection work as well, supported by the ILO, also on active labor market interventions. And we're really trying to bring those elements together. Also looking at a national just transition plan, and also looking at the coal exit, same issue in several countries in the region, India, China, now also considering the commitment to, if not phase out, but phase down coal, I think is the new formulation in the COP agreement. So I think that's a really interesting example to look at, beyond the 5 countries we were talking about. And I think the discussion around which one or two of those you may want to study further is a long one. We may not want to cover it now in the last 4 or 5 minutes, but I'm happy to provide inputs on that bilaterally. Thanks.
Thank you, Marie-Christine. Lynn, maybe a word, then Cecilia. Lynn?
Okay, yeah, please. Yeah.
Maybe closer to your computers. We can't hear you very well.
Sure. Is it better now?
Yeah, good.
Okay. It's really great, and it's actually coming from the experience from Vietnam only. So actually it comes, sorry, yeah, it's actually continuing with the idea of system strengthening and also the idea from Amber, because actually when we work currently, actually, I'm working with the local government, and we could see actually the willingness to find a way to update the idea, to update the idea how to make things better. But of course, like giving the conventional idea of how to develop their city or like the for the country. So most of the time, economic growth being easier because it's being easily evaluated rather than like human development. But somehow they also willing to hear about like how we convey the message, like what Anda say. Social protection, environmental protection should not be the burden of coming along, but it should be part of the development. So coming from the local, like bottom up, also the really something that we should also take into account. And coming back to what Anna were talking about, like some bold idea or ambition that we should probably trying to convey. Maybe like when we talk about like cost delivery, that could be something it should also take into account or being researched or being tested, like whether it should be something nice. Because like, for example, in Vietnam, when we talk about poverty reductions, like when you talk about cost delivery, sometimes it could be being a contrast because people said poverty is coming from a lack of character. Or it's just a quotation from a historian that I read about, the one who wrote Utopia for Realists, that he said poverty is not about the lack of character, but a lack of caste. But also that also a debate about universal income, but we might not need to go directly into that, but could be something that research or maybe together with the government that we could also try to analyze whether it could be a scenario. And something that I may say when I try to work with the local government, the idea of bridging our knowledge or the knowledge we are currently discussing at the moment to the knowledge with the one who actually implementing the policy is something that we also need to think about. And thanks a lot for, I don't know whether Marie-Christine or Cecilia mentioned about informal sector. It's yes, informal sector, informal worker, they are probably the beneficial in our social protection policy, but also informal sector also involved in kind of alleviate the issues in the social issues. What we could see in the COVID-19 here in Vietnam, how informal actions have been part of a really huge measure to alleviate the impacts of the COVID-19, but how the contribution, how big they are or how they could be combined is still kind of like unknown and should be researched. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Lynn, for these many compliments from the Vietnam case. Cecilia?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. It's actually more to try and answer your question about, well, to try to pose more questions around your kind of region-specific focus. And I was thinking, why are investments in the region, both in social protection and environmental protection, low? And I think, it's a region where social protection is significantly lower than in most regions of the world, right? And I wonder what the reason is for that. And I was actually thinking of exactly what Lynn was saying, in what way social protection and environmental protection are perceived in terms of sort of investments or burden. And is there a way to change that? Is there a way to put pressure on some key points? For instance, I think one of the things we haven't talked about when talking about coordination is, the ministers of finance, right? And kind of how do we make the case for this being more than just a burden, right? And being essential to that transition. Because otherwise, we're going to see a huge demand on social services and a huge increase in poverty, which is something that technically they wouldn't want to see, right? Ministers of finance. So that's one thought. And the other thought is civil society. Is what are the pressure points there? And I was just thinking of a very different context, but just also to demonstrate how new this conversation is, because in Europe there has been this policies for putting in place a carbon trading system for the transport and the building sector. And then the European Union decided to kind of go ahead with this, and then someone said, wait a minute, you haven't put anything in to compensate people that are going to suffer from these policies in the increasing price in transport and building. And so finally the European Union was, okay, well, maybe we need some sort of social climate fund. And now, there is a consultation around what shape the social climate fund is going to take, and, what is it going to look like, and how is it going to compensate people from those other policies put in place for cutting emissions. And so this came about because of pressure from civil society, right? And I think this is an important point that we need to consider, although it's different in different regions. But also just to say, it's very new what we're trying to kind of push for here, as the case of the European Union. I'll just stop there, and thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia. A word from Dr. Ambu, and then we close with Alexandre and Pascal, right?
Okay, thank you. Just a quick intervention and just a reaction to some of the observations. One is that ASEAN is different from EU, and here the most this power lies not in the secretariat but in the national capitals. That is the first point I want to make, and the second point is there is a high political will for achieving the social protection that can be seen from all the government development plans and the policy documents. But indeed, there is a difference in the plans and the implementation. And for example, the Southeast Asian countries are high in the climate risk, but it is a hard fact that only 16% of the population and the industries are insured. Why this gap? And we can see there are three possible reasons. We did a survey. One is there exists a knowledge gap, basically the access about the knowledge about these instruments available. Second is the decision-making capacity at the sectoral level. And the third is the finance, that is a finance capacity. And here basically private sector, basically they don't want to lose money. They don't want to be the first loser, where they're expecting the government guarantees. So this is the fact, and this is the hard reality, and it has to be improved. And the third part is this how we can combine this ODA that may be of interest to AFT. And here we can look into how Japanese ODA and FDA system worked in the 1980s and the 1970s and 80s. The first, the ODA comes in and to build the social infrastructure. It is for building the schools or the hospitals and then roads. These are the basic infrastructure, and once it is ready, then FDI comes in, the private sector comes in, and they're bringing these investments in the industry or the production networks or the supply chains. It automatically enhances the spending capacity and the social production capacity by the companies. This worked very well in the 1980s and the 1990s, and it lifted and it covered this kind of combination of FDI and ODA policies worked, and nearly 30% of families, that is low-income families, are covered by the social protection. So it could be one of the models to be emulated by the other development partners of ASEAN. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this additional reaction. Yeah, Alexandre and Pascal, I leave the floor to you for really the concluding remarks, and we will close them. Yeah.
Thank you, Etienne, and thank you, everybody. Well, it's not exactly concluding remarks, only a few thoughts, and very briefly, as I see that we are running late. I believe that the question that was raised by Garima was that of the legitimacy of social protection. And I guess this is a very important question because it's about raising awareness about social protection, but not only. I think that legitimacy of social protection is linked with other policies to show that it's not a burden. No, it's not. And to legitimate social protection, it means that, as Anda said, services have to be of good quality, are useful to the population, and scope has to be broad, because not only the poor are concerned, or not only the poor are concerned by climate change and by environmental challenges. So it means that the scope has to be broad, both in terms of beneficiaries and in terms of events that are taken into account. As Cecilia or Dr. Ambu said, it's not only extreme events that have to be taken into account, I guess. And another thing is about solidarity and redistribution, because if the scope is broad enough, then there is solidarity and redistribution. And sorry, we had no time to respond all the questions that were posed in the chat, but it's not only the case when it is private social protection, for example. There was a question about this, and I guess private social protection can be considered as social protection if there is solidarity, if it's not actuarial insurance, in fact. And it's the same regarding solidarity and redistribution. And there is also an issue of the effectiveness of the tools. about cash transfers. For example, we had no time to talk enough, but maybe we have other opportunities to meet online or to talk. And we know that if cash transfer miss the target, as there were some studies about that, it's not a very, let's say, it's not very effective in terms of legitimacy of social protection. So I guess we have to keep all this in mind. Sorry, it was not a conclusion because it's too difficult to conclude now. I guess all this is work in progress and many questions have been raised. And thank you all for all these comments and to share your knowledge with us and your experience. For us, it was very, very important today.
Yes, it was very dense indeed for us. There is a lot of stock taking to be made there, I think, and we will work on that in the next few days with all of you as well. So we will come back to you about what we take out of this discussion and where we want to go further in the coming month. So thanks a lot again. Very nice workshop, very nice discussing and meeting you, and talk to you very, very soon on these issues. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.